Today, this month, May, is Jewish American Heritage Month. I don't know if you've gotten much stuff in your email about it, but I have. I think it's from a couple of museums that I belong to, but it made me think about, I was asking my younger son, whose name is David, one time, how he thought he developed a strong sense of Jewish identity. And he said to me, well, going to camp was one thing. And then the other thing, Mom, is that there never a day went by when we were growing up that you didn't mention that so-and-so was Jewish, or did you know that such and such was Jewish? So I was shocked when he told me that, but apparently it's true. But I guess that's part of Jewish American Heritage Month, and very relevant to Jennifer's topic today, her resistance genealogy topic. Today is also Erev Shavuot, which is the Jewish holiday that celebrates the giving of the Torah. And if Debbie would be so kind, I found a cute cartoon. I can't hear you laughing because everybody's muted, but I'm hoping you're enjoying my cartoon. Do we have any guests today? Could people wave or unmute themselves and tell me if they're guests visiting us? I think all of our attendees today are our members, so welcome to our members. We have some great programs lined up for subsequent months. On June 27th, Steve Morse, the famous Steve Morse, will be talking to us about his website, stevemorse.org. So before that meeting, go ahead and take a look at it and practice with some of your family members and see if you can find them using stevemorse.org. In July, Rhoda Miller will talk about Russian and Eastern European records. And my guess is that 75%, maybe more of us are looking or trying to look at Russian and Eastern European records. So I'm hoping that this will be very helpful for everybody. In August, Nolan Altman is going to talk to us about the genealogical value of Jewish burial records. And this is an area that is so important, and Jewish Gen maintains an enormous website, Jobber or Jalber, Jowbr, Jewish Online Worldwide Burial Records, which is so useful and I have used many times, and which some of the cemeteries in this area contribute to. And Nolan Altman is the #1 expert. He maintains Jalber, and he just knows everything about burial records. And in October, we will welcome again Christine Cohen. She has spoken to us before. She's going to talk about naturalization and immigration records. So we've got, as always, Debbie has planned great programs for us with great speakers. So I hope everybody will attend those meetings. David Zendels, do you have a treasurer's report? It's attached to the agenda.
Yeah, very few changes from last month. No change in membership, no change in income. We had $128 of additional expenses last month. Our bank account is at $3,771.
Any questions for David?
Just thank you, David.
You're welcome.
I know that who is that fellow who absconded with all the money a couple of years ago, passed away, and I was
Bernie Madoff.
Bernie Madoff, what a name, you know. And I was just, you know, we did, Jennifer, just so you know, we did do a genealogical check on our treasurer before he rose to that prominent position to make sure he had no relationship whatsoever to Bernie Madoff, just so you know.
And I can also let you know that Barbara and I are on the board of the Raleigh Hebrew Cemetery, and he was not buried in Raleigh.
That's good to know. I wouldn't want him buried anywhere near us. Bad man, bad man.
David, are you from New York?
Yes, from Brooklyn.
I guessed. Can always hear it. My parents are from the Bronx. I can usually narrow it down to borough. That's one of my good parlor tricks, but I need to hear you speak a little more before I can do that.
You want to know what section of Brooklyn?
I could probably guess, but tell me.
Borough Park.
Fellow New Yorker.
Any questions for David about the report? Thank you very much. The treasurer's report always pops into my mailbox about 3 days before I think that I want to ask David for it. It's great. Does anybody have any old business? As far as new business goes, we don't have any questions today from our members for a brick wall session, but everybody's welcome to stay after the meeting and to chat or to talk about what we've learned today. Jeffrey Spencer is our chairman of brick wall discussions and does a lot of the groundwork to help people answer them. So if you have anything you're interested in having him look at, just shoot him an email and maybe it'll be on the program for next month.
Barbara, I think we do have a good question, right, Jeffrey, for next month, but send them on. Jeffrey and I like looking at these puzzles. So, or if you know of somebody who has a brick wall question, just send them to Jeff or to me.
Your board of this organization is going to meet toward the end of June, and we're hoping to carve out a path so that our December/Hanukkah meeting can be in person. And I think considering how things are going, it's eminently possible, but we want to encourage everybody to get vaccinated. I'm guessing this group has a pretty high percentage of people already who've been vaccinated, but it will certainly help our planning if y'all could get vaccinated. And we'll let you know what we decide is possible after our meeting toward the end of June. It's my honor and pleasure today to welcome Jennifer Mendelsohn, which, if you think about it, Mendelsohn is a perfect name for a genealogist. And one of the questions I wanted to ask her was, did she ever find out who Mendel was? Jennifer is a very accomplished journalist. She's published many, many places in the United States. She is also a professional genealogist. And in the last presidential administration, she began something called resistance genealogy. I don't know what your reaction was to the initial Stephen Miller stuff about immigration, but I remember saying to my husband, what the heck is he talking about? How did his grandparents get here? Great grandparents. I mean, you just automatically, as a Jewish person, know that a person's ancestors did not come on the Mayflower. And apparently that and many other things inspired Jennifer to begin resistance genealogy. I want to welcome you back to ACC country. Jennifer is a graduate of the University of Virginia. Wahoo wah. And I wish you were here with us right now. I wish we were all together in some place in the RTP. Before you go looking at her family tree, yes, Jennifer's brother is Dan, is it Dan?
Daniel
Mendelsohn, who is a very accomplished classicist, writer, editor, book reviewer, professor. He's written a couple of books that are relevant to our subject today. Hold on.
I'm actually going to talk about one of them. So
yeah, I still use a pen, Oh, The Lost, which was written in 2006 about finding what happened to Holocaust victims, and 2021, An Odyssey, a book about studying and traveling with his dad about his academic specialty. I think all of us bring to genealogy whatever skills we had in our professional lives or our personal lives. Jennifer as a journalist and a reporter who has to get the details. My degree is in library science, and we were always taught you don't just tell somebody the answer, you show them how to find the answer. If somebody says, I need to know the value of pi, you don't say 3.1416, you take them to a book that shows them the value of pi. And that's sort of how I've done my genealogy. And I think that Jennifer has used the journalistic approach to resistance genealogy and all of her other projects. So Jennifer, it's yours.
Well, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be with you all today. I appreciate the ACC mention, although I have a son who's a junior in high school who has expressed some interest in Duke, which is going to be, a little bit problematic for me, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. So just to be clear, this talk is not at all about resistance genealogy. I sort of keep my political activity separate from my professional genealogy talks. So this one is a pure genealogy talk. And it's interesting to see the list of speakers you have coming up, because I see that they all are talking very specifically about, specific record collections, et cetera, et cetera. This talk is really sort of a big picture talk. It's about an approach and how that approach helps me be successful as a genealogist. It's a mindset. One thing you learn as a reporter, especially the sort of reporter I was, which was just sort of a general feature writer, I was dropped down week after week into sort of unfamiliar territory, a medical story, an education story, a feature story, a crime story. And I had to quickly get my bearings and learn how to figure out the story. And genealogy, as this talk will detail, is much the same way. People ask me all the time on Twitter, how do I find, Finnish marriage records? Well, I don't know where Finnish marriage records are, but I know how to find Finnish marriage records. I'm not an expert in everything. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that process. And by way of entry, I'm also going to tell you a little bit about my own backstory and quite literally how I got into genealogy, because it's sort of part of the story. So, and this talk runs about an hour. We're good, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Take all the time you want. I'm geared up and ready to listen to you. I'm one of your biggest fans.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so here we go. Okay. So in the past couple of years, as your lovely introduction pointed out, I have gotten a fair amount of public attention for my work as a genealogist. Landed me on TV a bunch of times. Oh, look, I'm wearing the same shirt. I was profiled in the Washington Post and in the New Yorker, which was sort of a dream come true. And in perhaps the peak ridiculous moment, I ended up on Norwegian television, subtitled in Norwegian. And that was definitely not something that had been on my agenda. Some of you may also be familiar with this best-selling book by Danny Shapiro, which also got a lot of attention. And I do a lot of work with DNA research. And for anyone who doesn't know the story, Danny was raised in an Orthodox Jewish household in New York City. She was very, very connected, especially to her father, who came from a very prestigious Orthodox Jewish family. And she was rather unnerved to discover from a DNA test that she was actually only half Jewish biologically. And in the course of a very charged 45-minute phone call, we were able to determine that she was actually donor conceived. And by the end of the 45-minute phone call, we were staring at a photograph of her biological father, who she had no idea was anyone other than the father she had grown up with. And she wrote about that experience and now hosts a podcast, and a movie is being made out of the book, and it's all very exciting. However, This is all relatively new for me. For many, many, many years, for over the course of a 25+ year career, I was on the other side of the story. I was a journalist, mostly as a freelance writer, writing for all different publications. Some of them are listed here. I will say that one thing that served me well in my career as a journalist specifically that would lead to journalism was I always had a fascination with debunking, sort of getting to the bottom of myths and legends and things that people said were true but turned out not to be true. My friends for a long time, they nicknamed me Mendel Snopes after the Snopes website, because whenever something was circulating on the internet, they knew that I knew, because I used my reporting skills, I could always get to the bottom of things and figure out, well, no, that's not what happened. I also, for many years for Slate, wrote a funny column about the supermarket tabloids. So I sort of learned that the techniques, the sort of the original fake news before that became its own phenomenon. I learned about the techniques that people use when they're not telling the truth. And I learned sort of how to separate the truth from fiction. And just to prove it, I dug up this embarrassing photograph of myself interviewing Shania Twain for People magazine, probably about 1996 or 1997. But that was my work. That was my career. As was mentioned in the intro, there already was a high-profile genealogist in the family. That was my brother Daniel. You know, he was. I always say there's one kid in every family who's the one who like sidles up to all the old people at Rosh Hashanah and wants to hear all the family stories and know about the old country. That's Daniel on the right with our maternal grandfather, Abraham Jaeger. And on the left is a typewritten version of the family history that Daniel began working on in the 70s. So this was totally Daniel's thing. I had zero interest. And Daniel in 2006 wrote this book, which became sort of a huge international bestseller. He became determined to see if he could find out precisely what happened to our 6 closest relatives who perished in the Shoah in what is now Ukraine. Although I did get lucky, and in 2001, when Daniel was working on the magazine piece that would become the book, my older brothers very kindly offered their poor struggling freelancer sister a ticket to come along on the trip to Ukraine. So I got to see our ancestral town, which was incredible and life-changing. But it still didn't turn me into a genealogist. What turned me into a genealogist was a random, completely innocuous conversation in the spring of 2013 with this lovely woman. This is my husband's late grandmother, Frida Pertman, who died just a few months shy of her 100th birthday in 2017. In the spring of 2013, we were on our way to a graduation party, and I was just sort of making conversation with Frida, we called her Mama, in the car. And as luck would have it, I had just recently discovered Ancestry, and it sort of intrigued me. It was a completely random. I had Googled something that led me to the 1940 census, which I thought was fascinating. I had never seen the census before. And just as a reporter, it sort of spoke to me. I thought, oh, this is so cool. I'll start, poking around and looking for my parents and my grandparents. And, before I knew it, I was looking for like my milkman's brother-in-law's, 12th cousin. Like I just got really into it. And this was just a couple weeks later. And Frida was a Holocaust survivor from Poland. She lost 99.9% of her entire family in the Holocaust, unfortunately. Both of her parents, her only living grandparents, all 6 of her younger siblings, and just about every aunt, uncle, cousin, that she had ever known. And I always say that the way that she and her husband survived could be its own hour-long talk. But suffice it to say, they survived because they left Poland in November of 1939, and everybody else stayed behind. So when I got on Ancestry and started building my tree, my story is that virtually everybody emigrated. The book is about the 6 unfortunate members of our family who did not. And I always assumed that Frida's story was the exact opposite, because everyone had unfortunately been killed because they stayed behind. So what I said to her that day, because I had been looking at, immigration and ships manifest and naturalization papers, and I was sort of just thinking about that great migration from Eastern Europe to the US in the early part of the 20th century. I said, Frida, when you were growing up in WWII, was there a lot of buzz about coming to America? And she looked at me imperiously and just she said, no, not really. And then she sort of paused and she said, well, of course, you know that my mother's 2 older sisters went to Chicago before World War I. My mother was supposed to come with them, but the war broke out and she was left behind. And I've told this story so many times, and I say that this is the point, if it were a cartoon where like my eyes would bug, horizontally out of my head. I was like, your mother had 2 sisters who came to America. And I remember thinking, like, I knew Frida had like a second cousin once removed in Canada. And I knew she had a first cousin because they had left Poland before the war also. And I was like, I never heard about 2 aunts in Chicago. What is she talking about? And I said, Mama, who is that? Who are those aunts? Because I'm thinking, well, if she had 2 aunts in Chicago, she has cousins. And she got very quiet and she said, I don't know. She said, the war broke out. They somehow lost touch. And when Frida finally came to the United States in 1958, she did the one thing she knew how to do. She wrote a letter to a guy who supposedly was the person who knew where everybody had ended up. And she asked him what became of these aunts. And she never heard back. And she later heard that he had died. So when you're a newly arrived Polish immigrant who doesn't speak English in the United States in 1958, and there's no internet and there's no anything, what do you do to find these 2 aunts who went to Chicago before World War I? You do nothing. Very importantly, she didn't know their last names. She only knew their first names and their maiden name. She had no idea. She had a little bit of information about them. And I looked at her and I said, Mama, we have to find them. Like, this is insane. You have family, as I've written about it later, I said this was not a woman who could afford to have 2 aunts unaccounted for. And she told me that she believed one of them had died of cholera, which sounded odd, but okay. She said one of them had died of cholera in Chicago. Well, I became a woman obsessed. I sat at my computer for literally 2 solid weeks. I ignored my children. They were like cobwebs growing on their bowls of cereal. I just thought I have to do this for her. And again, I had never done, I was 2 weeks into my genealogical career, so to speak, but I just sort of thought, well, let's think I was doing a story about these 2 Polish sisters who came to America. There's got to be a way to find out what happened to them. And I had no idea what I was doing. I was looking for people dying in Chicago. I just sort of went very scattershot at it, but I got lucky because I began to search for arrival records. And again, this could be sort of its own hour. But I realized that for the first time in her 95 years, Frida Pertman was wrong about an important detail. She believed that both of these sisters had emigrated as married women and that I wouldn't find them because she didn't know their married names. But I actually found one of them arriving on a ship unmarried under her maiden name, and she was headed to her sister, not in Chicago, a very important lesson for a newbie genealogist because myth does not often match up to reality. They actually were headed to Lynn, Massachusetts, to an address on Summer Street in Lynn, Massachusetts. Using just this information, I followed the trail of those 2 sisters in Lynn, Massachusetts, and discovered that neither of those women had ever stepped foot in Chicago. Those two aunts had led very long and happy lives in Massachusetts, dying as recently as 1984. That's Aunt Bessie, who ran a knitting store on the right, and Aunt Rachel on the left. And I went back to Frida 2 weeks later, and I sat her down on the couch and I said, Mama, I need to tell you something very important. I said, you have 3 living first cousins. And it was, I can't even begin to put into words how moving and meaningful it was, especially when we learned that one of them had the same Hebrew name as Frida's mother. I felt like I had sort of disrupted the space-time continuum after all these years for this woman who had lost everybody, to learn that she had close family, you know, first cousins, their mothers were sisters. So it was an amazing experience for all of us. So then the floodgates opened, because I did what I do, which is I wrote a story for Tablet Magazine telling about this incredible experience of reuniting them. This was in the summer of 2013. And after this piece appeared, I got an interesting phone call from the daughter of some of my parents' oldest friends. And she said, I read the piece that you wrote about your husband's grandmother. We're so happy for you. And I wonder if you know that my father was adopted. And I said, no, I had no idea. He was 87 at the time. I'd known him my entire life, and it had just never been, I'd never been told that he was adopted. And she said, well, we have a little bit of information about his birth family, and I've always wondered if we could find them. You seem to know how to do this genealogical research. So do you think you could find them? And of course, you know, flush with beginner's luck and hubris, I was like, sure, I know how to do genealogical research, you know, let me at it. So I just sort of did the same thing again. She had some information. She actually had a name, which is, I've now learned, having done scores and scores of these searches, you know, a name is sort of 100,000 times more than most people have. She had a name and she had a little bit of information. So I just sort of approached it the same way. If I was trying to find a woman with a certain name in Brooklyn who lived at a certain time, and I knew a little bit of information about her family, how would I find her? And this is a page actually from a coffee stained page from the actual work that I did. And while I was working on this, I had a bit of deja vu. And the deja vu was that it reminded me of this, which may or may not be familiar to any of you, but this is what is called a logic grid puzzle. And this was a kind of puzzle I loved to do when I was a kid. And the way a logic grid puzzle works is you're given, in this case, 5 pieces of information about a group of people, and you have to use all that information to sort of click all the people into their proper place in the grid. It tells you Gina and Ian are the only couple to have non-identical twins. Daphne is Mark's mother. Iona is Ben's mother. Claire and Vanessa are not sisters. And you have to sort of figure out where everybody fits. And that's exactly what doing this genealogy search felt like. Well, at the end of that search, I was able to tell this 87-year-old adoptee that he had 2 living half-sisters who were very eager to meet them. So at that point, I was feeling kind of like this. And again, it was all beginner's luck. And I just got lucky. You know, my first time out, I sort of hit a grand slam home run. And then I had this nice follow-up and I thought, this is something I could do. So I started to mainly do volunteer work. I spent a lot of time on Tracing the Tribe on Facebook. I started helping friends. And then I realized that there was sort of a qualitative difference. And I like to make clear, I would never, ever posit myself as, you know, the world's greatest genealogist. But I realized that there was a method that I used that helped me find things very quickly that people would often say, I've searched for years to find my grandfather's manifest and I've never been able to find it. And I would literally find it in 5 minutes. And I thought, well, what is it that I can do that is helpful here? So I realized that being successful in genealogy was tapping on many of the same exact skills that I had honed in many years as a journalist. the ability to find stories, the ability to solve puzzles, sleuthing, having receipts, meaning always having sources and not just saying, well, this is true because someone else said it's true. It's like going to a credible source and proving it and having actual evidence for it. It's about myth busting. And as I was saying earlier, it's very often just about knowing who to ask when you don't know. It's not about knowing everything. It's also, if there's one thing I want you to take away, it's this process that I'm about to describe. This is the cover story in People magazine from July 11th, 1994. And this was one of the first stories I worked on when I first started working at People magazine. And it's a story about Maurice Templesman, who some of you may recall was Jackie Onassis's boyfriend at the time of her death. And Maurice Templesman was a South African diamond merchant. Now, when I walked into the People magazine offices the day that I was told to get to work on this story, you need to understand that the way People magazine and a lot of the news magazines work is the country is divided up into territories. So when there's a big story like this, everybody sort of works on their piece of the story. And I was based in Washington, D.C., so we were responsible for any information about Maurice Templesman that might be in our territory. And I sat down, and the seasoned reporter next to me, I said, what do we need to do? What are you doing? And she said, I'm calling around to all the African embassies. Why was she calling the African embassies? Because knowing that Maurice Templesman was in the diamond business, she very smartly thought that perhaps somebody at the African embassies would have interacted with him. And it was like the light bulb went off in my head. It's like a flycatcher. How is it you get the best information? You think creatively about what way you're going to get to your target. Now in journalism, usually, like in this case, Maurice Templesman was alive. Hopefully somebody was going to get him on the phone or could have gotten him on the phone and actually talk to him. In genealogy, those targets are often, you're not able to get them on the phone. So you have to think creatively. Where can you go? Where can you search that's going to yield information about your target, perhaps indirectly? This was another example of using that same skill. This was a story I did for USA Weekend magazine in 2003, and it's a profile of Matthew Broderick, who was then appearing in an ABC version of The Music Man. Now, the story is straightforward. I went to New York, I interviewed Matthew Broderick, I came back and wrote the story. However, you'll notice that on the right there's a sidebar. Now, my crazy editor thought of a brilliant idea. She said, The Music Man is the quintessential high school musical, right? Everybody's high school had a production of The Music Man. She said, let's do a fun sidebar where we find famous people who played Harold Hill in high school. Well, how do you do that? You have to think creatively. How was I going to find that target of famous people who had played Harold Hill in high school? But I somehow did it. And we found a bunch of famous people who had played Harold Hill in high school. And I do remember there's a funny thing at the end. I finished by saying, honorary mention to CNN's Anderson Cooper, who wondered if we would count his star-making turn as mayor of Munchkinland in a 4th grade production of The Wizard of Oz. Nice try, Cooper. Anyway, so you want to think about it like a dartboard. Your target, the person that you're researching, is at the center. But like I just said, in genealogy, if you're looking for someone, who died in 1892, you can't just directly reach out to the target. So what I like to do is think about the ways that you're going to use those concentric rings outside the target to get you to your target. And the clues are always there. However small, you just need to be able to use them like a breadcrumb trail. And the specifics may change from search to search. The clues that are going to get you there may come from a voter registration, an obituary, a contact address on a manifest, a contact person. But people's lives, what we research in genealogy, do in fact leave these clues via a document trail. And you just need to think about how to find them. In one case, I discovered a second cousin of my mother, a branch that we hadn't known anything about. And I had the cousin's maiden name, which was Miriam Cosner, but I couldn't find a marriage certificate, and I couldn't find what her married name was. Again, I'm trying to find what became of these people. So I started Googling, and what I found was a copyright listing for a 1978 paper. She was a like organizational psychologist, and it was an academic paper called Organizational Development and Social Climate in Hospitals. And the author was a woman named Miriam Cosner Mills. Was that her? I don't know, but there aren't that many Miriam Cosners, so I gave it a shot. And I tracked down that this same Miriam Cosner Mills had worked at a place called the New Jersey Institute of Technology, and she had co-authored an article in a magazine called Public Administration Quarterly. So I looked up her co-author, who very conveniently was listed, with an email address, so was still a professor, and I sent her an email. And I said, by any chance, do you know if this Miriam Cosner was a refugee from Germany, blah, 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 blah. Totally was her, led me to the family, the whole thing. You just have to be able to, think that way. Now, what I see people doing all the time that will not be successful is being scattershot. Someone posts in one of the genealogy groups, my great-grandfather was named Abraham Cohen. He was Russian. His wife's name was Bessie Feinberg. They owned a deli in Cincinnati. So how do I find more information about this? And then the next reply says, my next door neighbors growing up in Jersey City also had the name Feinberg. Would you like me to message them? That is not the way you are going to be successful. You don't if I were reporting a story about a Russian immigrant named Abraham Cohen who had a deli in Cincinnati, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't start that story by searching for information about the restaurants of Cincinnati or by researching all the Jews of Russia. And I wouldn't do it by tracking down Cohens who lived in Jersey City. What you want to do is zero in on your Abraham Cohen and your Bessie Feinberg and that specific deli in Cincinnati. I just realized, hang on, I think I forgot to click the button to share sound. So this might not work, and I don't know how to fix it now that we already started. So unfortunately, this might not work, but
I may be able to the way you do that is, if you want to, is go up to where you're screen sharing and it says view options. Can you see that? Or,
okay. Share sound is clicked. We're good. Okay. So how do you find your Abraham Cohen, the deli? Oh, and I forgot to say, going back, what you don't do is start by searching Jewish Gen. That is the absolute worst way to find your guy. You need to sort of cement your guy in specifics before you do the broad search, because if you just search for an Abraham Cohen on Jewish Gen from Russia, you are almost certainly going to start following the wrong Abraham Cohen. So what do you do? If I were a patenting sort of person, I would patent this. I call it law and order genealogy. What you do is you follow the Dun-Duns, just like an episode of Law and Order. Now, I always assume that in the year 2021, it is unlikely that there's anyone watching this who has never seen a Law and Order episode. But on the off chance that you never have, Law and Order is a police procedural where every episode is exactly the same way. It begins usually with the discovery of a dead body, and you see something like this. The dead body is discovered at 179 East 75th Street. And they go and they start asking around, well, who was the last person to be with the deceased? Oh, it was that guy, James. James is a colleague of ours. He used to work here, but he doesn't work here anymore. He now works at Sharp Data. So the next thing you see on the screen is they go to Sharp Data, right? They follow the trail. They need to find James. And then, can you hear that? Every time you change locations, you hear the dun-dun. Well, in doing genealogy, it's just like an episode of Law and Order. The dun-duns are the document trail, and every document that you open that gives you a new piece of information is a dun-dun that you're going to follow to that next logical destination. So where are the dun-duns? They're in absolutely every document you look at. Here is a random obituary I pulled. It gives us so much information that we can now follow up on. We know that when Saul Blum died in Baltimore in 1956, we have his wife's name. We have his wife's maiden name. We know the married names of all his sisters and where they live. All of that is great information that you're going to follow. This is the obituary of the writer Buzz Bissinger's father, and there's an important dun-dun in it. What jumped out at me was it says that Harry Gerard Bissinger was the dear brother of Eli Kaufman. Well, that's a dun-dun to follow up on. Why did the two brothers have different last names? I'm going to assume that it means that maybe they had different fathers and the same mothers, but that immediately is a piece of information that you're going to follow up on. The data is always telling you a story. And the one cool thing about doing this is that you start to realize that you know more than you realize. People think, well, how on earth could I find Abraham Cohen? But you know a lot about him that's going to help you sort of wade through the mess of information and zero in exactly on him. This is a census listing for the Proctor family, but when you look carefully at who's living in the census with the Proctor family, there's an 84-year-old father-in-law named Burwell Jones, who's a widower. All of that is great information. What does it tell us? It means that very possibly Betty Proctor's maiden name is Jones. We know that her mother is dead. So if we're going to sort of continue to build out the tree and the story, we have some information that's going to help guide us. On the other side, I had just found a marriage record for a Barney Sherritt. And the marriage record said that his mother's maiden name was Walitsky. So I wanted to find Barney as a child in the census and find out, I was really looking for more information about his parents. And when I found this census listing, I noticed that he's living with a relative with the last name Walitsky. So that, again, that's a clue, that's a dun-dun. You're gonna follow up on that. That's making you believe that you're getting close to the right people. It's very easy to sort of find the census and not pay attention to what it says. If, for instance, there's a child living in the census who's 10 years old, but the census tells you that the parents have only been married for a year, that's a clue that you need to pay attention to. It suggests that though that married couple are not both the parents of that child. If the mother is not old enough to be the mother of the child, that's often a clue that she's a stepmother, though she's listed as a mother. Always, always, always pay attention to the boarders living in a census record, because they are very often relatives, even though they are listed as boarders. This is the old man's draft from World War II, when men born between 1877 and 1897, so in their 40s to 60s, were required to register for the draft. Very often a great source of information. In this case, we find out that Louis Katz, he gives his place of birth, Czernowitz, which is in Galicia in Austria, Bukovina actually. So that's a great clue. Here's a marriage record from New York City from 1914, gives us the town in Italy where both the bride and groom were from. And my very, very, very favorite, by the way, if there's time later, I'll tell you a funny story about why I have that draft registration for Louis Katz. The contact people on manifests, because once you get past sort of the first half of the first decade, I forget actually when it was codified, but around 1900 or so, you started seeing great manifests like this that are chock full of information. They tell you the name of the closest relative that the person left behind in Europe. And then always on the second page, they give you the name and relationship of the person to whom the person was headed in the United States. And that can be a huge clue in the Dun-Dun Trail to follow up and build your tree. If, your great grandfather, Shlomo Finkelstein lists a brother at an address in New York City, you want to go, and your next dun-dun is find that brother at his address in New York City, because something else might open up from there. Every address is always a huge clue, because when you're trying not to be scattershot and you're trying to zero in on your people, addresses are one of those things that can lock your people into that logic grid, because there can be lots of Abe Goldbergs with wives named Sarah and a son named Jacob, but there is typically only one Abe Goldberg with a wife named Sarah and a son named Jacob who lives at 224 East 4th Street. So that's how you know that you have the correct person on the death certificate or the manifest, or the naturalization paper. I so often see trees on Ancestry where people haven't paid attention to the details, and they literally think they are from a different country than they really are, because they have attached the wrong person's manifest because they weren't careful. I saw Steve Morse is coming. Probably the tool of Steve's that I use every single day is the Census ED Finder. And what this allows you to do, unfortunately, it's a little bit of a learning curve to learn how to use it efficiently. But what this can do is, let's say that great-grandfather Shlomo, lists a brother named Harris Finkelstein and an address in New York. And by searching Harris Finkelstein, you can't quite find him. What you can do is you can go to the federal census that is closest in time to when he arrived, and you can reverse search the address. And very often, maybe Harris Finkelstein was mistranscribed as, Barry Minkelstein, and that's why you're not finding him, but the address will match. And that is a great way to zero in on the correct people and build your tree outward. And I always say that when the process works, it looks like this. You start with this tightly closed bud, one little piece of information, 2 Polish sisters, you knew their first names, but by being persistent and following the trail, the whole story unfolds, and it can often lead to information you never planned on finding. So I'm going to show you step by step one example of how this process looks in actual practice. This was from the tree of a client that I was working on. Now, this is the 1971 obituary of a man named William Gold, who died in Baltimore. And this was my client's grandfather, and he knew absolutely nothing about him. So I had begun to work on the tree, and we found this obituary. And at that point, I knew about, I'd worked up we knew about all of his children, and I knew about all of his brothers. I had, found them in various records. But the obituary mentions that it mentions he had a late brother, Samuel Gold. And this was the very first I had heard of him having a brother named Samuel. So let's watch what the process looks like when I tried to find information about this Samuel Gold. Now, remember what I said earlier. You know a lot more than you realize you do. So just from that name, Samuel Gold, here's what we know without doing a moment's research about Samuel Gold. Well, if Samuel Gold is William Gold's brother, we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that he's about 20 years within range of William's age. And somebody always likes to point out the rare exception. Well, I like to say, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. So for the sake of argument, we're looking for a man who's probably within 20 years of William's age. We know that they were probably born in the same place, which in this case, they were Galicianers. So his place of birth on records is going to be listed as Austria or Poland. But again, that's a huge leg up. We're not looking for a Samuel Gold who's Russian or Polish or Hungarian. We know that he died before 1971. So anyone we find who's a Samuel Gold who's still alive after this obituary, which said he was already dead, is not him. So I began to search. And I found in the 1940 census a Samuel Gold, also living in Baltimore, who ticks all the boxes. He was born in 1898 in Austria. He's living with his wife, Annie, and his daughter, Rose. But the one thing about this Samuel Gold that popped out at me was that it says his occupation is garage owner in the garage industry. And that immediately made me think, because people are creatures of habit and families stick together. And you know what all the other Gold brothers did? They were in the automotive industry running garages. So I thought, I wonder if this could be brother Samuel Gold. So I found this Samuel Gold's petition for naturalization from Baltimore. And I began to strongly suspect that this was in fact my Samuel Gold, because I should have mentioned earlier, I knew about these Gold brothers, that their original name was Goldhirsch. They changed it. And that they were from the town of Buchach in Galicia. Well, this Sam Gold says that his original name was Israel Goldhirsch and he was from Buchach. But it says that he arrived on the 15th of March, 1921 on a ship named the Calabria. So, again, could all be like an incredible coincidence, but I want to find all those receipts that are going to lock it in and we'll know for sure. So that's our dun-dun clue. We're going to go look to see what we find on the ship Calabria arriving on the date that it said. Now, This is a little confusing unless you've done a lot of research in Galicia, which I have because 2 of my grandparents were Galicianers. Some of you may know that in Galicia, it was very common for, unless the parents had a civil marriage, the child was considered illegitimate and for legal purposes had to use the mother's surname as their last name. Now, because of the research that I'd already done on this family, I knew that the Goldhirsch's mother's maiden name was Zwiebel. So when I went looking for the Israel Goldhirsch who arrived on the Calabria on that date, I did not find an Israel Goldhirsch, even though he says that that's the name he arrived under. He actually arrived as Israel Zwiebel. Well, how do I know for sure that this is my guy? Well, he's coming to his brother Max Gold at 1450 Maryland Avenue. And I already knew that this was the address of William Gold's brothers Max in Baltimore. So see, it all fits. But there was another dun-dun in that record. He says that he is leaving behind his closest relative, his brother-in-law, Lea Neufeld in Buchach, which of course is misspelled. Welcome to my world. Now, Sam Gold at this point was a single man, and assuming that brother-in-law is used literally, the only way a single man has a brother-in-law is if he has a married sister. So this piqued my interest because I thought, well, who is this Lea Neufeld? Was there a sister? Nobody mentioned a sister, and the obituary doesn't mention a sister. That is a dun-dun. I want to go find Lea Neufeld and find out who he was and how he connects. So I went to JRI-Poland, which is where the records for Buchach are, and I searched for any records mentioning a Neufeld and a Goldhirsch, and I found a very interesting record. What I found was a 1923 marriage record for a woman named Charlotte Neufeld. And what it says in this record is that she is the daughter of a Lea Neufeld and a woman named Hula Rosa Zwiebel vel Goldhirsch. And what that means is that her name was, it refers to that sort of legal wrangling over the correct real name. It says that she had one parent who was a Zwiebel, and that was her legal name, but her father was a Goldhirsch. So that was the name she went by. So this was very intriguing to me because this would suggest that the Gold brothers in Baltimore had this sister named Hula Rosa that nobody knew about. So this is the actual, I love these old, beautiful records. It's the middle record there on the left, the birth of Charlotte Neufeld. So immediately I want to know more. What became of Hula Rosa, their sister? So I went back and searched again, and I searched for any additional records mentioning a Hula Rosa Goldhirsch. Now, unfortunately, that turns up nothing. But just to be sure, I searched on JRI-Poland for any other records mentioning Lea Neufeld, this brother-in-law. And very conveniently, what that turns up is that Lea Neufeld married again in I forget what the date is. And very conveniently, the second marriage record for Lea Neufeld tells us the date of the death that his first wife, Hula Rosa Neufeld, née Zwiebel vel Goldhirsch, died. Now, did I start this search by looking for the death date of Sam Gold's sister, William Gold's, well, both of their sister? No, I did not. I began this search not even knowing that the Golds had a sister, but by following the clues and following the trail, this is where it led me. A great piece of information. There was a sister who died in 1915 that nobody knew about. So then the next step would be to get her death certificate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's that bud opening up. I'm going to also show you how I followed the dun-duns on William Gold's wife, who was from a completely different part of the world. She was from Ukraine. Her maiden name was Elizabeth. Well, she called herself Elizabeth. Her name was Lea. The original name was Landa. It was often rendered as London. And I found that when she arrived, this is her manifest, she was headed to an Uncle Isaac Landa or London in Philadelphia. So I searched and I found that Uncle Isaac. And again, I want to keep going backwards as far as I can. So if this was her uncle, presumably because the matching last names, her father's brother, I want to find every document possible on him, because that's going to give us information about, you know, her parents and her grandparents and all of that. So I found his arrival. And when he arrived, it says he's going to a cousin named Max, and I thought it said Publisky at an address in Philadelphia, 2512 Stonehouse Lane in Philadelphia. And I searched 2512 Stonehouse Lane and for someone named Publisky every which way, and I couldn't find it. But again, it's that reporter's mindset of persistence. You don't just back down if you can't find it. I know that this guy arrived and he was headed somewhere, and that guy exists somewhere. It's up to me to find it. If I'm not finding it, that means I need to rearrange the parameters of my search to find it, because this person who's listed on this manifest existed. So how did I find him? Well, I decided to use wildcards, which is my absolute favorite way to search. And again, I know more than I realize. So this guy, Isaac Landau, was born, I think, in the 1860. He's arriving. So any cousin of his, I know, is also going to say that they were born in Russia. I assumed very broadly. I gave a 30-year range for how old I thought he was. He lived in Philadelphia. I knew that. In this case, I couldn't find it by searching the address. And I thought, well, let's just be a little broader. His first name starts with P-U-B. Well, what that turned up was that there was a family called Publicker who matched that description in Philadelphia. And when I searched the newspapers, boom, bingo. Harry Publicker lived at 2512 Stonehouse Lane, which is the exact address that he listed in the census. So now I know that these people are relatives of my target, and I want to find everything about them, because that's how the family tree grows and grows and grows. And just to defend myself, this is why I couldn't find them in the census, because that bottom box is where it says 2512, completely illegible and water stained and impossible to crack. But I did go back later because it was bothering me so much. So in this case, this is my paternal grandfather, Abraham Mendelsohn. And to answer your earlier question, I do know who the Mendel was, because the Mendelssohns come from Latvia, and Latvian records are abundant and wonderful. And we actually trace the Latvian records to my 6th great grandfather, Chaim Mendelsohn, who was born in like the late 17, I forget, I'd have to look at my tree. And that is about when the records begin. So we believe that Chaim was the original son of Mendel. So Chaim's father, Mendel, was probably the original Mendel. Now, I want you to know, though, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of how I went from knowing who my 6th great grandfather was. I want to show you where I started. We knew nothing. My grandfather, this is his marriage license to his first wife in New York City in 1912. He does not know the maiden name of his mother. I'm sure all of you have relatives who are like this. And as far as we knew that he had been born in Riga, Latvia. And we knew, unfortunately, that he had come from a very big family, but he had lost all 10 of his brothers and sisters, and he was the only one to survive to adulthood. He lost his mother when he was 12, and he was sent out to work. We knew that he had a brother, that his father, my grandfather had an uncle named Wolf Mendelsohn, and that was about all we knew. And my brother Daniel one day said to me, you know, Poppy once said to me that he thought he had some cousins in Cleveland. Okay, so that at the beginning was the sum total of our knowledge of the Mendelsohn family. And I'm beginning with a spoiler, because you now know that we traced the Mendelsohn family extensively. How did that happen? Well, in this case, I just want to show you how much information, how many dun-duns were gleaned from a single document. In this case, the petition for naturalization of my great-grandfather Isidore. Very first thing I noticed, again, all we know is Riga, Latvia. That's where my grandfather was born. Well, the very first arrow at the top is pointing to the fact that my great-grandfather said he was born in a place called Schönberg, Latvia. I have never heard, at the time, I had never heard of Schönberg. I had no idea what that was. But again, that's a dun-dun. I want to follow up on it. The second arrow is pointing to the fact that we remember that as genealogists, we often deal in inaccuracies and myth and information that, it's like the sirens off the rocks that's trying to lead us astray. In this case, like many immigrants of his generation, my grandfather's family arrived in 1892. So this was before 1906, when you would have had to have a certificate of arrival. He made up the name of a ship that he came on. He says he came on the Titania, which I think sounds lovely and very majestic. There is no ship called the Titania. I have their manifest. They were on a ship called the Gothia. They arrived in the summer. He has the date wrong too. They arrived on August 8th. He says he arrived on July 20th, but that's important. Now, the third arrow points to the name of the witness to my great-grandfather's naturalization, a man named Herman Gabrielson. And we're going to come back to that one later. Okay, so here I am truncating a long story in the interest of time, because I want to get through the rest of these slides. If there's time, I can sort of walk you through the whole process. But suffice it to say that by following the Dunduns, I found my great-grandfather's brother, Wolf Mendelsohn. He was exceedingly difficult to find because he had changed his name to William Scheer. To this day, now being deep into my family tree, we still have no idea why he chose Scheer. It makes no sense. It's not his mother's maiden name. We just don't know, but I found him. Great. We were also, I had actually just told Daniel that I thought I had found him living in a mental institution out on Long Island. And I thought maybe that's why we couldn't find him. But I couldn't find a Wolf Mendelsohn, but he was hiding. Now, I found the petition for naturalization for William Scheer, who I now know is my grandfather's uncle. And I was all excited because look where the arrow is pointing. He had lots and lots of children, which means my grandfather had all these first cousins that he never knew or told us about or anything. And I have to say, as a kid from New York, from a baseball loving family, this led to the greatest discovery in my family's history of all time. Because from that naturalization document, I learned that one of my great-grandfather's brother's children was Henry or Heine Scheer, who was one of the few Jewish Major League baseball players. And he was quite a good baseball player. In fact, he was scouted by Connie Mack, who, if you know baseball at all, Connie Mack was one of the most legendary managers in baseball history. And if you, Heine Scheer has a Wikipedia page, which has the hilarious line, he was a teammate of Mo Berg, the very famous Jewish baseball player. And it says that they were perhaps the only Jewish double play combination in professional baseball history. I have also since learned that I am related to the guy who invented the rabbit ears television antenna, but I think this is a lot more exciting. So just to be sure, I scouted out a descendant of William Scheer and asked them to take a DNA test. And sure enough, they came back as a second cousin to my uncle, just as they should be. Their grandfathers were brothers. So it was all confirmed. Now, I'm going to go back to that last arrow on the naturalization page. And I like to say that doing genealogy is a lot like playing a game of the card game concentration. You always have to pay attention to the cards you've seen and turned over. If it helps you to write it down, whatever's going to jog it in your memory. Now, in this case, when I looked carefully at the naturalization petition of my great-grandfather's brother, William Scheer, I happened to notice that one of the witnesses was the same guy who had witnessed my great-grandfather's naturalization. Now, again, it could be a coincidence. They both lived in the Bronx. They both had the same profession. Maybe this guy was just a friend that they played cards with or something, and he witnessed both of their naturalizations. But just to be thorough, I wanted to follow the Dunduns and find out who Herman Gabrielson was. So I very easily found Herman in the census, living at the address in the Bronx that is listed on the naturalization. So I know it's him. He was a painter, just like my great-grandfather and his brother. And then I found Herman Gabrielson's petition for naturalization. And interestingly, I discovered he was from the same town that they were. Just to confuse you, my great-grandfather was born in Schenberg, which is also called Skiskalna. But when I started working on the family tree, he was born there, but the family was actually originally from a fairly big city in Latvia called Bauska. So again, I thought, I don't know, this guy could just be a landsman. He happened to live near them in the Bronx and he was from their hometown. But I started doing a little bit more digging and I found a public tree that said that this Herman Gabrielson's mother's maiden name was the same as my great-grandfather and his brother's mother's maiden name. And sure enough, it turns out that Herman Gabrielson was the first cousin of my great-grandfather and his brother. And I've also confirmed that with a DNA test of a relative of his, a descendant of his, who is my third cousin. And again, that is how you build a robust tree. Had I not followed that clue on Herman Gabrielson, I would have never busted open that branch of, again, and that's how you build a massive tree, by following the dun-duns. So a few more slides for you. So what happens when you follow the dun-duns and you get stuck? Well, the most important thing I want you to learn is to be able to assess, is it really a dead end? Are you really stuck? Or do you just need to rejigger in your head how you're searching to reach that target? Are you being stuck because you're not searching in the right way? Just like I knew Max Publiker was out there and it was up to me to figure out how to find him because he didn't come up easily. Especially dealing with Jewish genealogy, where we have Hebrew, Yiddish names in play, English names in play. We have town names that are called 3 different things depending on what language. There is so much morphing. In this case, I always like to remind people, these are 3 different records for the same exact woman. And look, both her first and last names are spelled 3 completely different ways on every document. So if you are not finding the person that you're looking for on a manifest, think like a reporter. Be persistent. You are going to find that person. And if you're not finding them, you have to think about how to search differently, because somebody out there knows Maurice Templesman, and it's up to you to figure out how to get to that person who's going to give you the good juicy nugget for your story. If that means thinking, maybe he went to the African embassies. So here are some examples of why you're going to be stymied, because if you are searching for a woman named Sarah Harkavy, you're going to find that she has been indexed as Lea Galkawi, and that she is from a place that I'm sure does not exist in Eastern Europe called Adawagozuguga. So in this case, I was searching for a woman whose name was actually Yucatel, but a certificate of arrival, if you've ever seen these, is great because it confirms that the person was on that ship and the name that they came under. So I thought, oh, piece of cake. It was spelled Urzitel. I'm looking for Toba Urzitel, who arrived on the New Amsterdam, which is the same ship my grandfather came on, coincidentally, on September 22nd, 1913. Couldn't find it. That's because this is how she is indexed, as Ranba Wuritel. So if you're searching too exactly, you're not going to find it. So that's when you need to bring wildcards into play. I will sometimes search ships manifests literally with no names whatsoever, because I do have information that's going to pluck my people out of the pile. I know their ages. Very often I know their hometowns. I use the Steve Morris Ellis Island Gold Search. I search for everyone on that ship who was within a certain age sometimes. Sometimes I just search by first name in case the last name is mangled. Sometimes I just search by last name in case the first name is mangled. I do all sorts of things, but wildcards can be your friends. Remember Sarah Harkavy, Louis Galkawi? I knew that she had siblings in New York City and I wanted to find them. And obviously if they're women, you're not going to know their married names. So how do we find them? Well, I searched the New York City marriage records for anyone else who listed the same parents as Sarah Harkavy. In this case, her father's name was Abraham Harkavy. Her mother's name was Fanny Steinberg. Now, if you search that exactly, you get exactly 1 hit. You get the marriage license of Sarah Harkavy. Well, I didn't want that. I knew she had siblings. I wanted to find them. So here's how I searched. I searched H?RK*. What does that do? The question mark replaces any possible letter that could be in between the H and the R, and the star replaces all the letters that could be. So when you have a name that can be mangled, you want to use these wildcards. And I just looked for a father's first name that started ABR, because we know that Abrahams can be listed as Abram. Sometimes ABR won't work it because they're listed as Avram with a V. So you have to get creative. And look what I found. I found the marriage record of a Harry Harcourt, whose parents' names have been indexed. Remember, these are not the original certificates. This is just how they're indexed. Then you want to go and get the original certificate to see what it really says, as Abraham Harcourt and Fanny Steinberg. So if I were just searching for ST, not going to find her because she's indexed under SHT, but this was one of Sarah's brothers. Also, I found her sister, whose last name is listed as Horkothi. And the father is Abraham with no A, Harkothi, and her husband's name is Alex Uhrenreib. And I was thinking, what kind of Jewish name is Uhrenreib? Well, when I got the actual document, it's Weinrib. So if you're searching for Alex Weinrib, you're not going to find his marriage license because it's been misindexed as Uhrenreib. In this case, I knew that this couple was married in New York City within a very small frame of time. Could not find them, could not find them. Her name was Esther Kobolansky. His name was Max Karp. Finally found it. Max was using the name of Marcus, which isn't that surprising, but Esther was using what must have been a middle name of Malka, so she has a totally different first name, but this was definitely them. When I pulled up the original, correct parents, correct everything. Okay, we're coming to the end now. In this case, I wanted to find the arrival of a man named Joseph Alpine. And I want to tell you, if you use that scattershot approach that I talked about earlier and just search for the arrival of a Joseph Alpine, you would be led horrifically astray in this case. Why? Because you want to find your Joseph Alpine. What I did first was I did a search in the newspapers. He lived in Cincinnati, and very conveniently, this is 1912, the names of people who had naturalized in the local court are listed in the newspaper. So I knew that there was a naturalization for him. That's a done-done. Also important, these Cincinnati naturalizations, not online. The record that you are looking for, very often people attach records that they think are the right ones just because they happen to come up online. But you need to know that this court in Cincinnati, the US District Court, those are not online. I had to, write off to a courthouse to get this naturalization. That's a done. Let's go find it. So I found it, found the actual petition. He gives us the date that he arrived, and he arrived on the Carpathia, which if you're a history nut, you'll know was the name of the ship that helped out the Titanic, right? Arrived on the Carpathia in 1904. He arrived under the name Shmuel Ulfan. So if you were looking for a Joseph Alpine, you're never going to find him. But following the trail very methodically, you're going to lead to him. And sure enough, when we then find the grave of Joseph Alpine, you can see that his name is Shmuel Yosef. So he arrived as Shmuel and then decided to start calling himself Joseph. Again, if you are looking for an Isidore or a Francis arriving, you're not going to find them. You need to find whatever their Hebrew or Yiddish name was, because that's what they're going to be indexed under. I stuck this slide in just this week because this literally happened just the other day. I'm working on a family and wanted to find the arrival of a Max Rothman. Well, if you had just been searching Ellis Island for a Max Rothman, you might have found the wrong guy, because this Max Rothman, when you find his naturalization paper, tells us that he arrived as Mattis Ratinowitz, which is great. Then I knew that his wife and son Julius arrived later, and I wanted to find their arrival. Couldn't find it, couldn't find it, couldn't find it. I thought I was being super smart. I knew from his grave that Julius's Hebrew name was Yehuda. So I looked for a Yehuda coming from their town, which was Shedlitz, within no names, or just Yehuda. And it gave me a list of 36 children in the right age range who came within the years that I thought. And when I started going down the list of those 36 children, I noticed a Yiddel Ratinovich. Well, Yiddel is the Yiddish name for Yehuda. So again, if I had just been searching for a Julius, I would have struck out. just searching for Yehudai, and look how it's spelled. It's, you know, again, if you were looking, if let's say Julius Rothman was your grandfather, I'm like, I can't find my grandfather Julius Rothman's arrival. Well, this is why, because he came as Yiddle written, which, you know, spelled a crazy way. So there are some pitfalls of the Dun-Dun Trail. You don't want to rely on ancestry hints too often. Ancestry hints are generated by other people's trees, and other people's trees can be a morass of bad information. As I was just saying, you don't want to assume that every document that you're looking for is going to be online. You need to sort of understand the universe of documents and make sure, like, find out, well, this county in Ohio, where are their naturalization records? If I'm not finding it on Ancestry or Family Search, maybe that's because they're not online and you have to write away, as I often do, to a library or a courthouse. Don't forget common sense. I like to use the mathematical principle of Occam's razor, which is the least likely scenario is often, the most likely scenario is the one that's the least complicated. And don't overthink it. Sometimes all it takes is a simple Google. Googling Miriam Cosner brought me to that article, which eventually brought me to my family. A metaphor that might be helpful is to think of yourself as a gatekeeper rather than a vacuum. Some people love to hop on Ancestry and start vacuuming up every hint they get and putting information in from every tree that they get. And they're like, oh, I just took myself back to Adam and Eve. Well, be discriminating. Don't let information into your tree unless it's been confirmed and documented. Remember that logic grid. You want to snap all the facts to the people and make sure that everything makes sense. That means if you're searching for Alina Rosenberg Weinstein, who you know got married in Boston after arriving, you shouldn't be attaching the manifest for a woman named Lena Weinstein. That's not her, because when she arrived, she was not Lena Weinstein. It means if you have the birth certificate of a Maury Katzenberg from New York City in 1901, the Maury Katzenberg who arrived on a ship from Poland in 1899 is not the same person. And if you have a manifest showing that he arrived in 1912 for the first time, that means that that family, even if they have the same names, living in New York City in 1900, is not him. And it means that if Abraham Melnick died in 1919, the Abraham Melnick who fathered a child in 1922 is not him. Now, the truth about ancestry hints is they are the sirens leading the sailors off to the rocks. It's okay to ignore them. I'm sure you are listening to this and thinking, oh, well, I would never make these mistakes. But I spend a lot of time looking at ancestry trees, and I can assure you that, and we all do it. I'm the first to admit I have in my haste made assumptions that I later realized were not correct. But some of these trees, man, whew, I see people attaching naturalizations for a person with the same name who lived in a completely different state and was naturalized 25 years after the person that they're interested. Or I see a man who has children named Sarah, Fanny, and Clara, and they have attached the naturalization of a man with the same name, but whose children are clearly listed as Jacob, Abe, and Harry. Or they attach the grave of a woman whose father's name you can clearly see on the grave is Abraham, and they have all these records saying that this woman's name was Moshe. So a tree is only as good as its creator, and some of them are good and some of them not so much. One very important practical thing you can do is you can always see on Ancestry what the source of information is, and you want your source to be documents, not other trees. So many people build their trees just by copying other trees, and look at this one. They have a man born in Germany in 1854 with children born, one in 1852, 2 years before he was born, and another born when he was 8 years old. So again, you're hoovering, vacuuming, and you're not thinking critically. So when you see that the only source for information is other trees, you need to check it out. There's an old saying in journalism, if your mother says she loves you, get a second source. You should use the same approach in genealogy. Everything needs a source. And again, if you want to say, you want to see some of the fun things that I have discovered that I'm sure none of you, hopefully none of these are your trees. We have a person getting married when they're 3 years old, and then a very precocious father who had children when he was 5 and 8, and also registered for the draft at 8. This one I like to call Hope Springs Eternal. Somebody died in Chicago in 1933, then was living in the Bronx in 1935, and just for good measure got divorced in Miami in 1969, 30 years later. So if you need one last reminder about how to be careful, I want to remind you of my great-grandfather's first cousin, Herman Gabrielson. This is the birth record from Latvia of Herman Gabrielson. It's in Hebrew and Russian. He was definitely Jewish, definitely born in Latvia. Now, if you look for Herman Gabrielson, should you choose to, on Ancestry, you will find this tree that has Herman in it. Now, I feel bad for poor Herman's wife. Herman's actual wife was named Rose, and they had 3 children, Benjamin, David, and Jean. Now, in this tree, this person has given his wife 4 other husbands. And while she had kids with Herman born in 1895, 1898, and 1903, she also has 20 other children who are all born between 1891 and 1911, which is very exhausting as a mother, I can attest. And finally, this is my very last slide, but it is the greatest. So you saw the birth certificate of very Jewish Herman Gabrielson from Latvia. I unfortunately forgot to note the year, but it's like, 1870, he was born in Bauska, Latvia. Well, this person has made Herman Norwegian. He was born in Wisconsin in 1861. His father's name was Ola Matthias, and his mother was Johanna Savaland. And, you know, they have some facts about my Herman. They have him living in the Bronx, but they've also given him like a completely different wife and turned him into a Norwegian man. So that is all I have for you today. Hopefully this will give you some good stuff to think about how to be careful and remember the dun-duns and look for the dun-duns, and remember that there are more dun-duns hiding than you may realize. So if you're really stuck, reassess, think what the information is telling you, and think what scene it is telling you to go to next, and where you're going to take your story, and that's how you're going to bloom that flower. So,
Jennifer, would you mind staying on the line, because I know there are going to be comments and questions. Barbara, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
That's right. I feel like I need to take a deep breath because there was so much good stuff in your talk, and so many of us have shared some of those experiences, but also made some of those mistakes. I did have to read out loud through several manifests looking for my grandmother coming into Baltimore. And I read out loud because I mean, she was Sarah. How else could Sarah be spelled? But I kept reading out loud, and on the manifest, it was spelled Sura, S-U-R-E.
Yeah.
And I was reading it as sure.
Right.
And when I read it out loud, I realized it was Sarah. I also got a warning once from one of the platforms. I don't remember which. I had a great grandfather who had 12 children with 2 different wives, and he had children into his late 60s or maybe early 70s. And I got an error message from one of the platforms telling me that I clearly had made a mistake, because this person couldn't possibly have had children over all those years, but he did. Thank you so much, folks. Do you have questions? Debbie?
And everybody can unmute to ask Jennifer. Again, Jennifer, I hope you will stick around for just a little while.
Sure.
You're a wonderful storyteller, as is your brother, and I imagine that maybe if you went back in time, you'd also find other wonderful storytellers in your family. One of our members indicated in the chat that she actually lived next door to Stephen Miller's grandparents. for 30 years, and they were wonderful people, progressive Jews. And his grandmother wrote a multi-volume genealogy on their family and their shtetl origins. So how about that for, apparently Stephen never studied that. Stephen, by the way, went to Duke. So Jennifer, if you want to, steer your kid away from Duke, that would be a really good reason. You said that if you had time, you would tell us about the draft registration for Lewis Katz.
Oh, it's just a really sweet story and a moment of genealogical serendipity. So the story is that when I very first, starting out, I started to build my tree, and I found my, this is on my maternal side, my grandfather's aunt and uncle living on the Lower East Side in 1910. They were living with all of their children, but I also noticed that they were living with a woman described as a niece named Yetta Bespiel. And I surmised, because I had done the work, that Yetta Bespiel, so these were my grandfather's first cousins, but Yetta was the cousin on the other side. It's that relationship that there's no name for, meaning she was the biological niece of the aunt by marriage. So this was my grandfather's first cousin's other cousin. So not a relative, but a relative in common. And she was like 15 years old, and it said that she was working in a shirtwaist factory. And I became obsessed with Yetta Bespiel. I was joking that I was going to write a young adult historical novel called Girl in the City. And I just started fantasizing about Yetta, and she was there all by herself, living with her aunt and uncle. She was a teenager. What was life like? What was the factory like? Was it hard? Was it easy? Was she happy? Was she excited to be in New York City, or was she, terrified to be so far away from home? So I tried to follow the Dunduns and find out what became of Yetta. And it got so convoluted, I couldn't find her. She disappeared. And of course, again, this was very early. I didn't know about using wildcard searches. Had I known about using wildcard searches, I would have found her. I couldn't find her. And I started going off on these crazy tangents. I found her sister's brother-in-law, and I traced them all the way to Yokohama. And I just and then at a certain point, I was like, this is ridiculous. This person is not even really related to me. I finally had to let Yetta go, right? And I completely forgot about it. I dropped it. She was my grandfather's first cousin, other cousin, and she's in the tree in 1910, and then never again. Until 5 years later, it was Purim. And I'm chatting with my mother, who is now 90. And I told her that I had made Hamantaschen for the very first time. I had never made them from scratch before. And she said, oh, that's so wonderful. Grandpa had a cousin who made the best Hamantaschen. She used to give us packages of them every year. Her name was Yetta Katz. And I said, Mom, Grandpa doesn't have a cousin named Yetta Katz. At this point, I knew the whole tree inside and out. I said, who was Yetta Katz? I said, you're wrong. She's like, Jennifer, I'm telling you, I knew this woman. Her husband's name was Louis. He worked at a bouncer at the bar called Mike and Eddie's in the Bronx. They had 2 sons named X and Y. So I hopped on Ancestry, and 5 minutes later, I'm staring at the son's Social Security death index, and it says that the his mother's maiden name was Bespiel. And I was like, oh my God, Yetta, I found you. It was so satisfying. So my grandfather had a friendly relationship with this woman who was not really his relative, but she was his cousin's cousin. And my mother knew her really well. And and then I went back, and of course, her marriage certificate, I have it on my computer, but I won't waste your time. It's misspelled. It's her first name is listed as Jessie. So I didn't find her because I wasn't searching for I was searching for a Yetta or a Yeti. And the last name is Bespril, Bespril. So now, of course, I could probably find her. But so it was just a sweet little moment of serendipity to find Yetta.
That's a wonderful story. I liked how you said earlier that that some of your discoveries disrupted the space-time continuum. I think that's a wonderful way of describing something that's more than just an aha moment. It redefines you. It transforms you. It transforms the way you think about yourself and your family. It gives you connections to things that you didn't think you were connected to. By the way, we had Danny Shapiro as one of our guests, and she talked a lot about you and how obviously that transformed her life in an amazing way as well. Well, I have some other questions, but let me, I don't want to hog
tell
your
you
time.
something interesting about that. When I did this, I was so focused on Frida, my husband's grandmother. You know, she was 95. She had endured so much loss. And as I did the search, I really honestly was just thinking of her. I thought, I need to find her family because it will be so meaningful to her. What I never anticipated was the beautiful fallout that this had throughout the family. And one of the most touching moments was my mother-in-law's brother, who is, I don't think he would find fault. I mean, he's a gruff, unemotional, he's an engineer. He's just very cut and dried and not like a touchy-feely guy. And he said to me, you know, I've never seen a photograph of my grandmother's face, and I never will, but now seeing these photographs of her sisters has brought me so much peace. And I just thought, like, oh my God, it didn't occur to me, like, they all grew up with no aunts and uncles and cousins too. And now they have family and they like went to see them in Boston. And, you know, so it really is it can have such a beautiful ripple effect through the whole family when you do one of these reunions. And now, you know, there's only so much time in a talk. Now I've done like many of them, and it's astonishing, really astonishing.
I think David wants to ask.
Yeah, well, just a little story. You mentioned finding a cousin in Lynn, Massachusetts. I have a cousin in Lynn, Massachusetts, but the story is reversed. He came from Moscow in 1992 with his mother, and his mother remembered Zendels coming to America in the early part of the 1900s, and Victor had no way of knowing how to find his relatives. But I found him in 2000, and my wife and I went to visit him. His mother had died 2 years before we got to visit Victor, but he was just thrilled that he finally found the family, because his mother kept telling him, you've got to look for the Zendels family. He had no idea how to find us. And then we found him and spent a pleasant day with him. And when we left, he said, I'm going to my mother's grave to tell her that I finally found our relatives in the United States. So it's a shame that he had no idea of how to do genealogy research.
Well, I try not to think about sort of the lost time, and, you know, that Frida could have like had her aunts in her life in the 50s and 60s. And I mean, one lived till the 80s, and that breaks my heart, but you know, we take what we can. And she was never the same after. I mean, it was so meaningful to her you know, she died like 4 or 5 years later, but to have that relationship with her cousins was just such an amazing thing after having lost so many people. You know, to just bring this back to her was incredible.
Did you ever follow up on Frida's idea that one of her aunts had died of cholera?
We think, you know, it's like I always say, I don't know if this will resonate with people, but I always think that sometimes these family legends are like a game of telephone, meaning the information gets passed from person to person and it just gets a little bit off. So one of the aunts had a first husband who died in fighting in World War I. And I think perhaps he died of cholera, and somehow that got garbled. And Chicago, we have no idea where that came from. You know, if I might still be looking for them in Chicago if I had listened to her. But, you know, we just got extraordinarily lucky that her one aunt had come under her maiden name and it listed her hometown. So I was able to find them. But
how do you deal with physically reading those descriptions of who their last relative was in the old country and where they're going in the new country? I find those the most difficult thing to make out.
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because I was just thinking about that. I'm now in a Facebook group for deciphering handwriting, and I look at them now and I can just do it lickety split. And when I first started, I couldn't. It's just like you just sort of, in fact, my very first ever post to the Jewish Gen listserv was about Frida's aunt's manifest, because it said she was going to BRIL. And I'm like, what is BRIL? Like, and now I know, like, that's brother-in-law. She was going to her sister's husband. The other crazy thing, and I won't name names, but the sort of unbelievable thing about the Frida search is that sister, the one that she was going to, ended up having a very, very, very famous and wealthy grandson. And when we first discovered this, I was like, oh my God, this is hilarious. You start this search looking for this old Polish Jewish lady's relatives, and and then it dawned on me, I was like, oh crap, because this was not someone that you could just call up and say, I have this 95-year-old Jewish lady who's your cousin. So it actually was like the worst possible thing that could have happened. And we ended up connecting through the non-famous branch, but that was an interesting sort of twist to the whole search. But
because those people, those very famous people, are trying to guard against people
exactly
in that way and asking for money or whatever.
Well, supposedly he tried to call her from his yacht in Monaco, but she was living in an assisted living facility, so she no longer had like a public phone number listed in Baltimore Information. And then we tried to put them in touch, and it never worked. And then she died. And I always say it is his loss, because she knew his great grandparents personally, and she was sharp as a tack till the day she died. So she remembered everything with sort of lightning precision. So as I said, there were two aunts, and we are now connected to the descendants of the other aunt, who does not include the famous person. So it's all good. And it's just been lovely. It's a nice, unfortunately, one of the first cousins died of COVID last year in a nursing home. That was sort of a sad coda to the story. But
Jennifer, what does your brother Daniel make of your obsession? So, I mean, since this was something he was interested in when he was a little boy, how does he feel about you now taking this so seriously that you have described it as an obsession?
I think he's pleased. He's sort of moved on. The funniest thing is that he forwards me every DNA match email. Like, he just doesn't even try anymore. He's like, I'm sending this to my sister. She'll figure it out. You have to remember also that when Daniel did the bulk of his genealogical research, it was in the days where he would literally write to archives, by hand, and there was no internet. I think actually I have right here. Hang on. Yes, this is so funny. I was just looking through an old box. What this is, it's dated September 1st, 1978. It's from the New York City Department of Health. And it says, this is to certify a search was made of the records of deaths in the borough of all borough search for the death of Joseph Mendelsohn, who died October 16th, 1918. This was my grandfather's brother, who we knew had died in the flu epidemic. So Daniel in 1979 was trying to find the death record, and they told him it didn't exist. And of course it does exist. I have it. He died in the Bronx. And yeah, so I was able to, and also the explosion in the availability of Eastern European records. I mean, I was able to take the tree, like, to explode it out in ways that he had never even imagined. I mean, he did do sort of, but only on our maternal grandfather's line. When he was researching the lost, we hooked up with a researcher in Lviv who was able to sort of get the documentation that took our Jaeger line very far back. But other than that, I mean, we knew almost nothing about the Mendelsohns. And I've also made incredible breakthroughs on our maternal grandmother's line. So, you know, the Lost only talks about our one family. And amazingly, we had a great grandmother about whom nothing, much like my grandfather, nothing was known. But in her case, it was even harder because there was nothing on paper. My great-grandfather, she was a second marriage, so they never had a civil marriage. They just had a Jewish marriage, so there was no marriage certificate. Neither of them ever became citizens, so there was never any paperwork or documentation. And he died in 1919 and she died in 1936, so no Social Security. There was nothing. She was just a cipher. We knew her name and that she was Russian, and we knew her father's name from her grave. And amazingly, and her story was that she had been orphaned in a pogrom and came by herself as a teenager and no family. So my grandmother, as far as she knew, had no cousins, nothing. That was it. Through DNA, I have discovered, amazingly, that this woman who said she was an orphan and had no family had a brother living in Brooklyn and a sister living in New Jersey. And we will never know whether she just lied, as so many people do, or in fact, she never knew that her brother and sister had come, which I can't even bear to think about the sadness of that, but it's undeniable. I mean, my mother tests as a second cousin and all the details match, the father's names match, it all fits. So it's crazy. And that was entirely by DNA, which is, unbelievable.
Yeah, these discoveries are bittersweet sometimes.
Yeah.
Bittersweet.
One of the things that I've discovered was when I found second cousins who were from Belarus, as my grandmother was. They were her sister's grandchildren. We didn't know that the other existed. It's really kind of amazing, but they were much more Russian or Belarusian than our grandparents were. Jewish people living in Belarus were not really citizens. But these folks who came in the late 90s, late 80s and early 90s were definitely Russian, and they have an attachment to Belarus or to Russia that we don't have because our grandparents didn't have that connection.
Right.
They were living in the Pale because they were forced to live in the Pale.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, it's always sort of interesting when I call myself Latvian, because I don't think my grandfather thought of himself as Latvian. They were Jews living in Latvia, but they never really identified as Latvian. So.
I mean, just that business about they couldn't get a legal marriage.
Right.
Yeah. Among other things.
Jennifer, I found it interesting, usually when people ask me for some guidance, I'm always, it's likely that I'm going to say, have you looked on Jewish Gen? And now I'm going to have to rethink that. You said, first think about your target, the likely sources, be creative. And you're right, Jewish Gen, like Ancestry, can be the source of, lead you down the wrong rabbit hole. So I think that was very good advice. And you reminded me of one of my genealogy teachers who said, genealogy without sources is mythology.
Exactly.
Just creates more and more family lore that can't be substantiated and just confuses people. And it makes me think also about how some people like to perceive themselves. And this is also why we have to be careful when we uncover family secrets, because it can be very disruptive to people personally. My mother misrepresented her age by 9 years. I have a couple of theories about why that is, but it made it very difficult for me when I was a beginning researcher to find her story, just because I was looking in the wrong era. So that's another thing to think about, that people create their own mythology sometimes because they're trying to preserve some perspective of themselves that they would rather not have uncovered. And I'm sure DNA has, I know we have at least one person here, Ed DeAngie, who has followed a very interesting family story, kind of similar to Danny's, that certainly is disruptive at the very best.
Yeah. Well, I want to reiterate, sometimes I forget the certain points that I mean to make. I don't in any way want to underestimate what an incredible resource Jewish Gen is. And I should have said explicitly, I always believe that you need to start here and get all the information you can here, meaning in the US. And only when you have a specific place of origin, ideally a town, then you can go to Jewish Gen. Because if you just start at Jewish Gen, you're also going to do that thing if you start at Jewish Gen, where if you see things that seem like they could be the right thing, you'll assume that they are, and then you're following the path of a completely different family. If you find the naturalization for your great-grandfather and it tells you he came from Schenberg, Latvia, then you know you can go to Jewish Gen and you're searching for Schenberg, Latvia. But if I had just started saying Isidore Mendelsohn, here's how old he was from somewhere in Russia, that could lead, if I start at Jewish Gen, that can be disastrous. Like you once you know where you're looking, then you can find where the records are, and not all of them are on Jewish Gen. You can, it's a mixed bag. So I should have said that explicitly.
Who else has a comment or an observation? We're so lucky to have Jennifer here. I know you've learned some things, but you may have some specific questions. We don't want to keep Jennifer too long. I'm looking in chat.
Maybe.
Yes, Roger.
I wondered if Jennifer has any techniques that she uses with people who just don't respond to inquiries about relatives that you have in common or family that you think that where they can give you additional information.
I mean, all I can say is that I sympathize. This is discussed ad nauseum in all the Facebook genealogy groups, like unresponsive people. And there's no magic formula, unfortunately. In my case, when it's like a DNA match that won't respond, I sort of go gonzo and just don't wait for them to respond if they take too long to respond. And I use all sorts of tricks to figure out who they are. And then I just start building their tree without them. I do that a lot. I do a lot of adoptee searches and searches where you have to sort of stay under the radar. So you can't just say, we match on DNA, who are you? So I do that a lot. But obviously in some cases you want to, have the family stories and photographs and all of that, and you really need the person to respond. And there's no magic formula. Some people talk about planting what they call cousin bait, that it's a good idea to make sure that you have a tree online somewhere that's public, so that people, if they're searching, can find you, which is one way to sort of reverse engineer the process. But, just make sure that your letter is inviting and not, I find all the time that even when it is nothing but a straightforward, hey, I'm your third cousin, can we connect? Sometimes people are suspicious. They don't know what you want. They don't know what you're after. So just make sure that your intentions are clear, and, but there's no, or if there is, I don't have the answer to how to write a letter that gets returned. I literally just got, here, I'll read it to you. A message in my inbox on Ancestry, and it is dated, God, the Ancestry messaging system, it just spins and spins and spins. On August 18th, 2016, I wrote to one of my DNA matches asking about his tree. And on May 3rd of this year, I got the following message: Jennifer, sorry for the slight delay, parentheses, 5 years, close parentheses. So, hope springs eternal, maybe they'll finally, get with the program. In some cases, it's hilarious because, people will write back years later. I'm like, I solved that adoption, 3 years ago. I no longer need you. But it's never too late.
I guess the answer is to have a lot of irons in the fire.
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're sort of most likely to strike gold the more that you put out there. I wish there were an easy answer of how to always get a reply, but if it makes you feel better, I very often do not get a reply. Even, I have to say, I worked on a case last year in the whole thing took over a year, but it was one of the most extraordinary I've ever done. There was a woman who was found as a toddler in an orphanage in Poland after the war. And she was taken along with all the other orphans to Israel by a woman named Lena Kickler, who's sort of famous. And she lived and died in 2016, her entire life, without ever knowing who she was, where she came from, how she ended up in the orphanage. There was no paperwork, nothing. But before she died, a neighbor gave her the gift of a DNA test. And I was brought into this search to help. She has a daughter who wanted to, know where she came from. And and all we had to go on was DNA. And I would write messages to people explaining this situation. We are trying to find the identity of a Holocaust orphan. You are her best match. Please write back. In another case I'm working on, there's a woman who discovered as an adult that she was born in a concentration camp. Her mother never told her. She was told that she was a year older and that she was born in the DP camp. So it turns out her biological father was not the man she knew. I have explained this to people in messages and they don't write back. And I'm like, I got nothing else. If you're not going to help, I've literally said to someone, you are her best match. We would be so grateful for any information you have. Nothing. They don't write back. So, it's like, if that's not going to get someone to try to help,
Debbie,
Yes, Susan.
I have a question for Jennifer. I think it's pretty quick. I also have worked on some adoptions and starting like you, while I'm still an amateur, but just got more and more and more into searching as friends and family asked for help. So I have a friend who discovered when she was, her parents discovered when she was about 12, that they had adopted her from Montreal in 1945 as a Jewish baby. They were immigrants and childless, totally thrilled with her, were thrilled with her their whole lives, but discovered that she was part of a scam that has become pretty famous. Have you run into the Montreal black market for, quote, Jewish babies? None of them are actually Jewish.
I am not familiar with that one. The one that I am familiar with is a woman named Georgia Tan, who sort of sold babies throughout the South. And she took a lot of Jewish babies from the Northeast and placed them. And in a very uncomfortable twist, I had a cousin that I did not know, but I tracked down through genealogy, a half cousin, and I was all excited to meet her and connect. And I asked her to take a DNA test, and she was 72 and discovered that she was adopted and had no idea. And it was only because I gave her this DNA test that she found out. And she has since discovered she was a Georgia Tan baby. So I said that wrong. Georgia Tan placed babies from the South with a lot of Jewish families, like in New York. So my cousin was born to like 2 Russian Jews in New York City. And she always thought it was strange that she had been born in Memphis, and her mother told her that they were traveling and she went into labor on a train. But it actually turns out that she was a black market baby from Memphis who was placed with this Jewish couple in New York. But that was incredibly difficult to, I sort of opened this can of worms. But to answer your question more directly, I'm not familiar with that Montreal
I'll just very quickly, this black market, the scam was revealed that it was a corrupt doctor who was providing false birth certificates. So my friend, I've been searching for years, and through DNA, I'm sure I've located her grandparents on both sides, but I'm having trouble getting responses from people. There isn't much DNA in the younger generation for her to match to. Anyway, and priests probably who, forced these young women to give up a child born out of wedlock.
Anybody else have any?
I'm just putting some things in the Susan, for you, in the chat. A couple of stories about what happened in Montreal with these adoptions. So you might want to. I just did a simple Google search and found all kinds of stories, and apparently there's a Facebook page dedicated to this story. You might want to follow up there as well.
Thanks.
I think we want to let Jennifer go. She's been so generous with her time, and your talk is terrific. I can and probably will listen to it again. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you to your parents who did such a wonderful job on you and your brother.
There's 5 of us.
I'm sure they're equally gifted, but they must get all kinds of nachas from their kids. I mean, just, I know your dad has passed on, but they must be so proud of you. So proud of you.
If any of you happen to be on Twitter, I highly recommend you follow my brother Daniel, because he has made it a practice of sharing the wisdom of what he calls Mom M. My mom is kind of hilarious, and he's very often tweeting out hilarious things that she has said and done, and she's a hoot. So
thank you again.
All right.
Give her a round of applause, everybody.
Thank you all for having me.
Okay.